If you ever feel out of control around food, you're not alone, and you're in the right place to learn practical, no-nonsense information about why you binge and how to stop. Binge eating does not mean that something is wrong with you. It's a natural but primitive brain response that you can correct. If you're ready for change, sign up for the Brain Over Binge self-paced online course for less than $20 per month. And if you feel you need personalized support, we also offer one-on-one coaching and group coaching. To learn more, go to brainoverbinge.com/subscribe. And I hope you enjoy the show. Welcome to the Brain Over Binge podcast, where we share a simple, brain-based approach to ending binge eating. This is Katherine Hansen. I'm the author of 2 books on binge eating recovery, Brain Over Binge, and the Brain Over Binge Recovery Guide. And I'm so excited to have my friend and colleague, Cookie Rosenblum, co-hosting this show with me today. And we're going to hear from Cookie in just a minute. With this being our first episode, I want to tell you what this podcast is all about. The purpose of this podcast is to share information and to share insights that are going to help you stop binge eating. We want to empower you, we want to encourage you, and we also want to take a lot of the confusion out of recovery. We want to help you get on a very clear path to freedom from binge eating. I want to welcome you to this podcast and tell you that you are not alone in this. I want to tell you that you absolutely can stop binging, and we're going to help you. And now I'm going to bring on my co-host, Cookie Rosenblum, so she can welcome you as well.
Thank you, Katherine. I'm excited to be here with you and speak to all of you listening today. And our goal is to teach you, just as Katherine has done for herself, and we have helped our clients and the women and men in our groups to teach you how to leave binge eating in the past, to have it become something that you used to do. And we feel so good about doing this because we've learned even more what you want and what you need from the groups that we've recently done. So thank you so much for being here today, and we're excited with what we need to share with you.
Thanks so much, Cookie. Now, before we get into teaching you how to stop this behavior, we want to talk about what binge eating actually is. And this is going to help you determine if this podcast is right for you or someone that you care about. Now, binge eating is a little different for everyone, but it's not just the simple overeating that most people do from time to time, like at a holiday or a big meal. It's not just having a little too much dessert or a little too much junk food. Binge eating is a much more compulsive and a much more destructive behavior, and it creates so much suffering in your life. Right now, I'm going to give you the more clinical definition of a binge, but remember, like I said, everyone is a little different. A binge eating episode is eating in a discrete period of time, such as a 2-hour period, an amount of food that is definitely larger than most people would eat during a similar period of time and under similar circumstances. Binge eating episodes are accompanied by a sense of lack of control over what or how much is being eaten. And this sense of lack of control is really key. And if you binge, you know that it can feel like you're someone else. It can feel like you have no choice but to binge. You can feel like you can't stop yourself, no matter how hard you try. And this really affects your life in a negative way. It can lead to shame and regret and frustration. It can affect your work. It affects your relationships and just your ability to live your life the way you want to. It can make you feel depressed and anxious and also very isolated. Now, some people purge after binge eating, and in that case, it's called bulimia. And purging can be self-induced vomiting, it can be laxatives, overexercise, or restrictive dieting. If purging is not involved, then it's called binge eating disorder, or BED. To be diagnosed with either bulimia or with BED, the binge eating or the binging and purging need to occur at least 1 time per week for 3 months. But for the purposes of our podcast, it doesn't matter the frequency of your binge eating. If you're doing it at all, it's causing pain in your life, and the information we're going to share can help you even if you don't have a clinical diagnosis. Now that I've shared some basic definitions and we've talked about what binge eating is and how this podcast is going to help you, I want to talk a little bit about my own personal story. And when I'm done, Cookie's going to do the same as well, because we want you to know that you're not alone in this and that we've both been where you are, and we know how hard it can be and how sometimes it can seem like there's no way out. But both of us believe that there is, and through our personal stories, we hope that we can inspire you to realize that freedom is absolutely possible for you. I was a binge eater for 6 years, and I was technically bulimic because I purged through overexercising and dieting, but binge eating was my primary problem. It was what I felt like I just couldn't seem to get a handle on for so long. I dieted for 2 years prior to developing the binge eating, and I also had a brief period of anorexia as well. When the binge eating started, it really increased pretty quickly, and it made me feel out of control, and I didn't feel like I could stop it on my own. So I ended up seeking help in the form of therapy, which ended up not being helpful for me. And a lot of my book is devoted to explaining how that was so and why the concepts I learned in therapy weren't exactly helpful, or in even some ways made things worse. Now, I'm not criticizing therapy across the board because I realize it has a useful purpose for a lot of people. But right now I'm going to talk about the concepts I learned in therapy, which were not helpful to me, and what my book aims to be an alternative to. So in therapy, I learned that binge eating was basically a coping mechanism for problems in my life, for difficult emotions. I learned that it was my way of sort of dealing with the pain I felt in my life or dealing with stress. I learned that binge eating was a symptom of underlying problems like depression or anxiety or low self-esteem or family problems, things that happened in my past. And to recover, I thought I needed to get to the bottom of all of this. I thought I needed to solve all those problems or to learn to cope better with all my emotions in order to stop feeling the need to binge or feeling like I wanted to binge. So I really went down that path for a long time, and I thought I needed some sort of fundamental transformation in my personality, in the way I approach life, to stop doing this destructive behavior. But despite doing all the right things in therapy, my binge eating really only got worse over the years. Until 2005, when I came across some very useful information about the brain. And what learning about the brain did was it simplified recovery for me. It showed me that there wasn't anything fundamentally wrong with me. I wasn't flawed or broken. I had just become a temporary victim of my own brain, and my own healthy brain. And I also learned that I didn't need to transform in order to recover. I didn't need to solve all my problems first. I didn't need to learn to cope perfectly with life in order to walk away from the binge eating. And I shared my own personal story and how I applied these brain-based concepts in Brain Over Binge in 2011. And then after writing that book, I began talking to many others who read it and who were helped by it, and I began helping hundreds of men and women. And I really got to see what helped them and then also where more information was needed. So in 2016, I published Brain Over Binge Recovery Guide, and this is really a self-help version of Brain Over Binge. It helps people apply these brain-based concepts in their own life, in their own unique way that works for them. Because I want to help people create their own path to recovery that really feels authentic to them. So that's my story and a little about what I share in my books. And now Cookie is going to tell us her story and how she also became involved in using the Brain Over Binge approach.
I have been a weight loss coach for over 25 years, and mostly I focused on emotional eating and general weight loss. And I did not have an issue growing up with my own weight. My struggle started as an adult when I had my 2 daughters, and they were little babies, and I had trouble losing my baby weight, my pregnancy weight. Well, that frustration led me to become an emotional eater. And it increased and it increased, and it became the thing that I thought about literally day and night. I woke up thinking about it, and I went to bed thinking about it. My weight, what I ate, what I didn't eat, whether I was good or bad. And I started realizing that by focusing so much on my eating and having such a diety mentality all the time, I began slipping into the world of binge eating. I began getting urges to eat large quantities of food just randomly because my whole world was so focused on restricting and watching what I ate to lose that baby weight. I was really miserable. And I was a weight loss coach at the time, so nobody knew what I was going through. I had a lot of shame. And I realized one day that I had worked myself into an eating disorder that didn't used to exist. I went from normal eating to very, very restricted diet eating to emotional eating and then to binge eating. So what happened for me was I literally woke up and scared myself, and I stopped binge eating just like that. I didn't know how or why I was able to stop, because this was before Catherine's approach was created. And all I knew was that I was scared enough, looking back now, for the part of my brain that was in charge and wanted the best things for me to take over and to stop responding to that binge to eat. I was so afraid that I was able to do it. I still struggled for a while with emotional eating, but it had nothing really to do with the binge eating. And now I don't do that anymore. Of course, since I found Catherine, I totally look at it in a different way. During this podcast, what we want to teach you, we're going to target is binge eating. And even if you have other eating habits, you will still find this helpful because it's going to teach you how your brain forms these eating habits and how to change them. Catherine, do you want to just talk a little bit about what the basic approach is to stopping the binge eating?
Yes, absolutely. The approach we'll talk about in this podcast is the brain over binge approach. And it's basically a simplified approach to recovery based on some very basic and very practical brain science, which we're going to share here. And don't worry, this is nothing complicated. The brain over binge approach is an alternative to the mainstream approach that I talked about earlier, the mainstream approach that says binge eating is a coping mechanism or a symptom of underlying problems. The brain over binge approach is about learning to see your binge eating in light of the brain, and then using that information to empower yourself. It's about changing your perspective to see yourself as fundamentally healthy and not broken and not diseased. In the brain over binge philosophy, binge eating is a natural but also very primitive brain response to restrictive dieting, which becomes a habit over time. Or binge eating can also develop as a primitive response to repeated overeating of highly stimulating foods, which increases over time and then forms the same binge eating habit. So it either begins after a period of dieting as a basic survival response, which was the case for me, or it starts a little more like Cookie talked about, where overeating starts and then gradually grows and builds over time. But either way, it's a primitive brain response that makes you feel out of control. And what we're going to teach you is to take control back. We're going to teach you to use the higher parts of your brain, your higher cognitive power, to begin overcoming the binge eating habit. And we're going to teach you to do this in an efficient and an uncomplicated way. We're going to teach you how to use the part of your brain that can overcome these urges to binge. Probably the most important thing you can learn up front when using this approach is that you are healthy. That there isn't anything fundamentally wrong with you. You're just a temporary victim of your own healthy brain. And right now, part of your brain is wired in a way that's harmful to you. But this is completely correctable. But to correct it, it takes some understanding of how the brain works, and it also takes some understanding of how you have the ability inside yourself to overcome this harmful habit. So the brain over binge approach is based around one big idea about binge eating, and that is there's only one cause of binge eating, which is the urges to binge. And I'm going to repeat that because it's very important to understand up front that the binge urges, this desire to binge, is the one and only direct cause of binge eating. Now, I realize at this point it may sound overly simple, but this idea is going to streamline recovery for you. So think about this. Each and every binge is preceded by an urge to binge, and no one would binge without that desire, that urge to do so. I define an urge to binge as any thought, any feeling, or any physical sensation that encourages binge eating. And it's important to see that without the urges to binge, you simply would not binge. Regardless of the problems in your life, regardless of what you've been through in your past, regardless of what emotions you're feeling, you would not binge without these urges. And this is really the opposite of traditional therapy that says the cause of binge eating is those emotions and is those problems and is those underlying issues. But really, it's just this strong urge, this strong push from your brain to eat massive quantities of food that causes you to do what you do. And if you don't understand why this is happening, if you don't understand the cause, it's going to keep driving you to do it over and over again. Think about a problem like depression. Let's say you're depressed, but you don't have urges to binge, you're not going to binge. It's the same with anxiety. If you're anxious, but you don't have urges to binge, you're not going to binge. And these examples really illustrate why the emotions and why the problems aren't the direct cause of binge eating. A main concept that I teach is that you binge not to cope with these emotions and with these problems, but in order to cope with the urges to binge. Because the urges can make you feel so uncomfortable and so out of control that you feel like you need to binge just to make the urges go away and just to stop this desire that you're feeling and these thoughts and these sensations encouraging you to binge. So you binge just to make that all stop. So we're going to really take a look at these urges, and we're going to teach you how to use your higher brain to take control back and to learn to not act on these urges without it being a fight or a battle. And like I said, we're going to keep things simple. So in this approach, there are only 2 basic recovery goals. And Cookie is going to talk about these and explain to us why they're used in this approach. So Cookie, would you like to talk about that right now?
Yes, and it's so important for you to hear this, that we only suggest that you focus on these 2 things. One is dismiss the urges to binge, and the second is to learn how to eat adequately. If you dismiss the urges to binge, you will not binge. There literally will not be a problem. That's why Catherine is explaining it as it sounds so simple, and we've all been taught in the past that it's a complicated issue, but it's the urges to binge that cause the bulk or 100% of the problem. So the number 1 goal is dismiss the urges to binge and then to eat adequately. If you learn to dismiss those urges to binge, then you're acting from your higher brain. If you don't respond to those urges, what will happen is they'll fade away, and then you will find that you're no longer binging. And if you stop dieting, and by that we mean eating restrictively, where you're hungry and you're not feeding yourself, not giving yourself enough food. If you don't stop doing that, then you're highly likely to keep those urges alive and put your lower brain back in charge, because it thinks you need to binge to survive if you're hungry all the time. Extreme dieting and restriction can lead to the binge eating response, and your cravings to binge will increase if you do that, if you keep restricting. This is a normal reaction. So the 2 biggest focuses that we're going to give you in this time together that you're with us here in the podcast with us or in one of our classes is recognize and dismiss those urges and then eat enough so that your brain doesn't think it needs to send you into survival mode by reawakening those urges.
Thanks for describing that, Cookie. Cookie and I have learned so much from working with our clients and our groups. We've seen what works for people, but we've also seen where people need more help. We're constantly noticing what questions come up as people learn this brain over binge approach. So in this podcast, we want to share many common issues and common questions that come up that relate to the topics we're discussing. When hearing about the 2 recovery goals, dismissing urges and eating adequately, a big question that often comes up is that people think it's much too simple. You may have been told by various sources like therapy that recovery needs to be a long process and that requires a transformation, and that also requires resolving emotional issues and complicated problems. So if right now you think recovery is complicated, and then you hear us say that it's actually simple and you need to just accomplish 2 recovery goals to recover, you may have some trouble accepting the simplicity of that idea. And this is very common, and we completely understand this concern. But we also want you to be open to accepting this simplicity. It's okay if right now you still think it's a complicated process to recover, but we just want you to keep an open mind to what we've talked about here in this episode and what we'll talk about in future episodes, because we think it's going to make a lot more sense to you as we go along. Although recovery doesn't happen the same way for everyone, it just doesn't have to be a complicated, long journey. And Cookie and I are both proof of that. We were able to stop our habits relatively quickly. So if you can't let go of the ideas that you've learned in the past that it's a very complicated process, it's okay, and you're going to get more information as this podcast goes along. Once you see these concepts that we're talking about working and you see them making a difference in your life, then you'll be more open to accepting the simplicity, and you'll be able to take control back from that lower part of your brain. And Cookie's going to weigh in on this issue as well.
Yes. When you're trying to accomplish a goal, and the big goal here for all of you is stop binge eating. Simple, right? Very important to you because of the way it affects your whole life. Well, we all have a certain amount of energy and a certain amount of focus that we're able to put on different things that are important to us. If we zero in on the most important cause and effect relationship in binge eating, which is the urges and following them, and then possibly restricting your food that keeps those urges alive. If we focus in on those 2 things, we get results. If you scatter, it's not to say, as Catherine said, that you don't want to improve the rest of your life, that you don't want to deal with emotions better, that you don't want to have better relationships. Those things are all possible, but they're not necessary. And if you focus on all of them at the same time, what's happening then is that you're scattering your focus, you're scattering your energy, and it's unnecessary. So we're going to really keep emphasizing the 2 main focuses and teach you how to keep your energy and your aim of focus on those 2 things, and push all the other things aside while you're working on this. You can always make other changes in your life, but let's deal with the binge eating first. And putting your focus on them, that's the way to go.
Yes, absolutely. And then that opens up your energy and your time and allows you to make any other changes you want to make in your life. That wraps up today's episode. Next time we'll be teaching you more about the urges to binge, and we're going to help you see them in a new way that's going to empower you and allow you to start changing your brain and ending this habit. Before we end, if what we've said in this podcast resonates with you and you want to learn more about the Brain Over Binge approach and get started applying these ideas in your own life, you can get a copy of my free ebook. It's called The Brain Over Binge Basics by going to my website, brainoverbinge.com, and subscribing. And I know that you all will be interested in learning more about Cookie as well. So Cookie, can you tell the listeners how they can learn more about you?
Absolutely, Catherine. And I want to also mention that links to both of us will be right in the show notes. When you click on Catherine's link, you will get on her mailing list. You can get that ebook, which is very valuable and packed with information that we're talking about. And if you're interested in what I do and my book, I'm giving away a free downloadable copy of my book. Just click on my name in the show notes, and I will be happy to send it to you.
Thanks, Cookie. We hope you can join us again next time. For now, this is Catherine Hansen and Cookie Rosenblum reminding you that you have the power to rewire your brain and to live a binge-free life. See you next time. The Brain Over Binge podcast is produced and recorded by Brain Over Binge Recovery Coaching, LLC. All work is copyrighted by Brain Over Binge Recovery Coaching, LLC, and all rights are reserved. As a disclaimer, the hosts of the Brain Over Binge podcast are not professional counselors or licensed healthcare providers, and this podcast is not a substitute for medical advice or any form of professional therapy. Eating disorders can have serious health consequences, and you are strongly advised to seek medical attention for matters relating to your health. Please get help when you need it, and good luck on your journey. Need more help? You can find all of our current and upcoming options for support at brainoverbinge.com.